So we finished our last lesson talking about photosynthesis and chemosynthesis. And so these last few slides are there to sort of finalize the comparison and show you what a food chain would look like in both of them, because then our next lesson is about food chains. So photosynthesis and chemosynthesis both store chemical energy. And we saw that this is in the form of carbs. So both processes are taking some form of energy and converting it into chemical energy, which is the energy in the bonds of a molecule, and specifically, it is a carbohydrate. Now, photosynthesis and cell respiration, although we're not going to talk about the detailed steps of them, are going to be important throughout this entire unit. And so it's important that you at least remember the basic idea of both of them. Cellular respiration uses chemical energy, and it produces ATP. It also produces heat. And then ATP is going to go on to do other things. So what we're trying to do is follow the path of the energy. Where does the energy go? So in photosynthesis, it starts with the sun, then it goes into this carb, and then cell respiration happens. In chemosynthesis, it starts with the deep sea vent, goes to this carb, goes through photosynthesis. The ATP is then used to do a whole bunch of things. And there are millions of things that we could put as examples here, so we'll just put a few. I've already mentioned things like muscle contraction, so I won't do that again, but I will remind you of things like cell division. If an organism wants to replace a cell or wants to grow and have more cells, energy is required for that process. Energy is used for movement. Now, depending on what type of organism you are, movement could be a little sperm flipping its flagella so that it can swim, or if you're a multicellular organism like a human, it could be a bunch of muscles contracting to pull on your bones to make them move. Acquiring food would be another process that is happening. Now at the cellular level, this would be things like endocytosis, where one cell engulfs another, kind of like what your white blood cells do. But on a grander scale, this could be the energy that's required to look for food, to hunt food, to find food, to get food, to digest food. Getting rid of waste would be another. So aside from food waste, which is usually the obvious one, don't forget that there is waste from breathing. When you breathe, there is waste in the form of carbon dioxide. It's like that for most land animals. For other types of animals, it might be different gases. But these are the kinds of things that organisms have to do to keep themselves alive. I could call these things vital processes. They're the things that you have to be able to do to be considered living. Now, if I ever asked you, what is ATP used for? Pretty much anything that happens in your body, ATP was probably used at some point. So there are so many answers that would be acceptable. And then it's important to recognize that the waste products of respiration, so when cellular respiration happens, there are waste products, CO2 and H2O. They are reused so that photosynthesis or chemosynthesis can happen again. So just like in our first unit, it is really important that you recognize that it's a cycle, that one doesn't really happen without the other. If nothing was using the chemical energy, there'd be no point in photosynthesis happening. Plus, if nothing was using the energy, the reactants for photosynthesis, CO2 and water, wouldn't be getting produced, and we would run out of them eventually. So, it's a cycle, Cycles are really big in Chapter 1 and 2. In Chapter 1, we're talking about the cycle of energy, and then in Chapter 2, we'll talk about the cycle of atoms, but the idea of reusing things is constantly present. Now, the next two slides, you don't have to add much to. They just sum up where energy goes. So, this is energy flow. It is happening in order. What kind of question asks you to put things in order? Numeric response. If I asked you to put things in order, 1 comes first, and usually there are 4 things, so 4 would come last. That means you use 1, 2, 3, and 4 if I ask you about 4 things. So the sun would be number 1, plants would be number 2, some kind of animal would be 3, maybe a decomposer would be 4. That would be a nice numeric response style question. Now, the other thing that's important to remember, and this goes back to the first unit, if light intensity increases, so does the rate of photosynthesis. So more light means more photosynthesis. More photosynthesis means more energy stored by plants. In other words, more carbohydrate production. And then there's a beautiful little picture on the side to show you the sun going to a producer. In every step, it's illustrating heat being produced as a byproduct to really reinforce the second law of thermodynamics. You'll notice that the arrows don't go in one direction, and that's because producers don't just get eaten by consumers. They can also be decomposed by decomposers. And that there are actually different arrows depending on if we're talking about energy or nutrients. We are really only talking about energy here. So on the picture, energy starts at the sun, goes to producers. It can either go to consumers or to decomposers next, depending on if the plant lives long enough to be consumed or if it dies. The energy from the consumers will eventually end up with the decomposers. And then you ask yourself, oh, well, that's not really a cycle. The energy kind of ended there. But don't forget, every step along the way, organisms are using energy to do processes, and those processes produce heat. So eventually, all of the sun's energy gets turned into heat. It might not happen right away, but eventually that's where all of it goes. On the next slide, we're talking about energy flow in a chemosynthetic food chain. So it starts with thermal energy. We could call that number 1. It goes to bacteria or protozoa. Protozoa are small organisms, unicellular usually, but they're eukaryotic. Then animals, then decomposers. Notice there are no plants here, so if I asked you about a chemosynthetic food chain, please don't pick a plant, because they are not typically part of that type of food chain. The picture on the side is to help illustrate this happening. So I'm just going to highlight a few places where you can see those worms, which would be near vents. Now, if you remember in the video we watched, not all vents are exactly the same. They don't all look the same, and they don't all have the same species. What they do have in common is that they generally start with this thermal energy, and then bacteria is what comes next. And after that, the type of organism would differ. Sometimes you saw it was crustaceans. In one of them, it was a shrimp. In the other one, it was little crabs. And so it depends where you are in the ocean. But these animals here could be things like shrimp, could be things like crabs. They're usually crustaceans of some type. If you remember, the crabs were hairy. I thought that was cool. And just like with energy flow in a photosynthetic food chain, if I start with one of these vents, I'll just pick this one, let's say. I go from the vent to my bacteria, to some kind of animal, to some kind of other animal. So energy will flow from usually a smaller organism to a bigger one. But every step of the way, heat is being released. So that even though it looks like there might be an ending point for the energy, there really wasn't. Every organism used a bunch of energy to live its life, and doing that produced heat. So lesson 2 is about trophic levels. Probably you heard at some point in your life in grade 9, people talk about a niche. I would prefer to pronounce it that way, even though you might have heard it called a niche, which is such an Anglophone way of pronouncing it when it's not what it is. I don't care how you pronounce it, nor whether you use that word or not. Basically, we're going to look at where organisms can be in a food chain based on the role that they are trying to accomplish. So this lesson hopefully doesn't have a lot of new things for you. Maybe it's just a reminder of things that you've heard of before. So the first thing that we'll do is give some definitions. Now, you might know some of these words already, and so if you'd like to take abbreviated notes, that would be fine with me. What is an ecological niche? What is a trophic level? They're basically the same thing if you think about their basic definition. An ecological niche is the role an organism occupies in the ecosystem. So what are they? Are they a producer or are they a consumer? What are they doing? And a trophic level is specific to food. Trophic, that word, or the word troph in general, has to do with growth and nutrition. So for example, hypertrophy was a word that we used in the muscles chapter. That was when the muscles grew a lot. And so the word troph or trophic has to do with growth. And to grow, you have to acquire nutrients and energy. So trophic level is specific about acquiring food, but very frequently the way we'll describe the niche of an organism is to say how they get their food. And so these two things, even though they're not technically identical, they're virtually indistinguishable in the discussion that we're going to have. So there are 1, 2, 3 basic levels, and these are not words that are, I'm sure, new to you. The first type of niche or trophic level is a producer. Producers are usually plants. Now, we just saw in chemosynthesis that that's not the only type of producer that exists. It's just the most common one that you would find. They take a form of energy and use it to make carbohydrates or other large compounds out of inorganic substances, CO2 and water. Now, we just said what a producer does in our last lesson. You probably know that CO2 and water are what we use, and that carbohydrates are what we produce, so it's reviewing. A word that I'd like to make sure everybody has is the word autotroph. I used it in passing in the unit on photosynthesis. An autotroph, so auto means on your own, and troph means food, so an autotroph makes their own food. In other words, they are producers. So autotroph or producer can be interchanged, basically, in this unit. So plants or chemosynthetic bacteria would be the two best examples we have of autotrophs. The next type of trophic level is a consumer. Now, on the slide that comes next, we'll be a lot more specific. I'll give you a bunch of different types of consumers that exist. But a consumer is an organism that either eats producers or other consumers. So you might know that some things are herbivores and some things are carnivores, and we'll be more specific on the next slide. But they're all consumers. Consumers do not make their own food. Consumers are what we call heterotrophs. Hetero means different, not the same. So a heterotroph gets their food from something that is not the same as them. Now, if you just use that definition, that would mean, say, a lion can't eat another lion, which is not true. We're meaning a different type of organism than themselves. So a heterotroph obtain their food from another organism. Now the third type of trophic level would be a decomposer. I could have put Decomposer in the same category as consumers, but because what they're doing is slightly different, I like to separate them. Their job is to take specifically dead material. A decomposer will take dead material, so an organism that has died, and will convert whatever they have back into smaller compounds. So we're getting the idea of a cycle. I needed some small compounds for photosynthesis to start, CO2 and water. Now decomposers aren't only making that, but they're putting smaller compounds back into the soil so that they can be reused. Decomposers are also called heterotrophs because they are not making their own food. They have to acquire their food from another organism. It just happens to be a dead organism. So like I said, we're going to take number 2 and we're going to really open it up and talk about a bunch of different vocabulary that can go with being a consumer. So there are a bunch of words here. Some of them you might be familiar with, some of them you may not be. I put a little picture on the side to sort of illustrate if it was a food chain, where would this organism be? A primary consumer, which we could also call a first order or first level or some other word that means one as part of its name. A primary consumer is the one that eats producers. So if we take a look, you'll see that on both of the food chains, whether it's a terrestrial one or a marine one, the thing that is eating the plant is the primary consumer. So on the terrestrial food chain, we've got an insect on the nectar of a flower. On the aquatic food chain, we have zooplankton. I'll just make a little comment here. Most of you might have heard the word plankton before, and you might be aware that they are small organisms that live in the ocean. If I look at the words zooplankton, and the word that's below it, phytoplankton. Look at the beginning of the word. When I say the word zoo, what do you immediately think of? A zoo, where you have animals that you go and look at. So zoo, as a prefix, is talking about animals. Phyto is talking about light. So zooplankton are plankton that are acting like an animal. Phytoplankton are the ones that can use light, and so they are photosynthetic. They're like tiny miniature marine plants. So zooplankton, like an animal, phytoplankton, like a plant. And I'm mentioning this because when we talk about aquatic food chains, they are very often at the beginning of basically any aquatic food chain that's close to the surface, and so you end up seeing them very frequently. A secondary consumer eats primary consumers. A tertiary consumer eats secondary consumers. Now, we could go on forever. I could say quaternary consumer eats tertiary consumers. Penta means 5, hexa means 6. I could go on forever. It's just that 3 is usually about the limit that we would put in a food chain. The idea is that these ones are numbered, so you wouldn't know exactly where they are in the food chain. Primary consumer is lowest. Secondary consumer is higher. Tertiary consumer is even higher. We could say first order, second order, third order instead of primary, secondary, tertiary. So in this example, I've got some carnivores. On land, it's a little rodent. In the ocean, it's some fish. They are going to eat the primary consumer. So the rodent will eat the insect. The fish will eat the zooplankton. Then I have some different things that instead of using numbers are using descriptions. Now, a herbivore is the same thing as a primary consumer. Herbivores eat plants. Plants are producers. A carnivore could be a secondary consumer or higher. It's not obvious. So if I just say the word carnivore, that does not tell you, are they eating the herbivore or are they eating the carnivore that ate the herbivore? And so while you are welcome to use the word carnivore, I think that primary, secondary, tertiary might be better because then it's very obvious where you are in the food chain. An omnivore eats both. So what level is an omnivore? Kind of depends. If it is a bear that is eating berries, it is acting as a primary consumer. If it is a bear that is eating fish, it's acting as a secondary or a tertiary consumer. So, an omnivore, we couldn't say specifically is one type. It depends which thing they're currently eating. So if I asked you a written question that was like, hey, what level is a bear? You could make a case for primary if they are eating fruit. But you could also make a case for secondary if they are eating another animal. Now a scavenger, if you just read the definition, you might think that it's a decomposer, but it's not. A scavenger eats dead organisms. Now a decomposer takes the molecules in an organism and returns them to the soil. A scavenger is not doing that. Now scavengers aren't typical members of every single food chain. Some examples of scavengers would be things like vultures and hyenas, who maybe follow around better predators than them, wait for them to kill an organism or just wait for an organism to die, and then rather than catching their food, they eat the organism that is already dead. A detrivore, which is also not part of every food chain, but in the lot they might be present. A detrivore eats waste. So it doesn't break the waste down and return it to the soil. That's a decomposer. A detrivore eats waste. So for example, let's go with something like a dung beetle. The organisms that you find feeding on piles of dog poop at the park, they are detrivores. Now the last one is a tricky one because it kind of sounds like a consumer and a decomposer. It's a saprotroph. That's an organism that digests its food outside its body, then takes it in. And because they digest outside of their body, inevitably, some of what they digest returns to the soil. This is where some types of mold and fungus go. Now they are decomposers. Normally, you could just talk about a plain old decomposer, say a mushroom, or something like that. But this is just a specific example that sounds like it should be a consumer, but is really more of a decomposer. Now, does anyone have any questions about trophic level descriptors?